This channel spends a lot of time and energy combating old myths and historical misconceptions about Chernobyl. But since Chernobyl is still making history, the past few years have seen new myths arise as well. If you were reading the news in February of 2022, you might still believe two sensational stories about the Russian invasion. They were widely reported in the media, but then quietly debunked. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was occupied by Russian forces on the first day of the 2022 invasion, as armoured columns rushed through the exclusion zone towards Kiev. At the same time, a network of interconnected gamma radiation sensors placed throughout the zone began to malfunction and drop offline. The radiation sensors readings were publicly available, published on a real-time map by the state-owned company EcoCenter. People watched from around the world as radiation levels at multiple stations spiked to several times the normal level. The monitoring station nearest the new safe confinement jumped 50 times higher than usual. 30 sensor stations showed an increase and then immediately stopped reporting. The ensuing media frenzy was understandable, and hundreds of news articles repeated the official explanation. Russian convoys had raised a cloud of radioactive dust while passing through the exclusion zone. This explanation was plausible enough at first glance that even the International Atomic Energy Agency repeated it in its press releases, without investigating further. To anyone more familiar with the zone, however, the story was suspicious from the start. Very few places in the zone ever had radiation levels as high as those being reported by the EcoCenter sensors. So why would dispersing and therefore diluting the radioactive dust create such high dose rates? How indeed would vehicles create so much dust by passing over mostly paved roads whose surfaces were damp due to the mild weather? Indeed, a professor of radiation ecology at the University of Salford in the UK would later state the following: even with conservative assumptions, you cannot get anything like the rises that we've seen in those dose rate spikes. The most important clue came from the website of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which shared 5 of the same radiation monitoring stations with the EcoCenter network. These sensors, including the one located next to Reactor 4, never showed any increase in radiation levels at all. Not only that, the plant's power sensors did not lose their internet connection until sometime in March. The EcoCenter stations reported high gamma dose rates and then dropped offline, but the power plant's 5 stations kept sending data to the website on an hourly basis. In fact, they only stopped reporting when Russian soldiers started marauding through the plant, thoroughly looting it of electrical equipment. Although the power plant's website has since come back online, the radiation monitoring map is no longer available. Since the 5 sensors at the plant provided far more detailed data about the radiation levels, shouldn't we dismiss the EcoCenter readings as unreliable? Multiple researchers and scientists have since concluded that the answer is yes. In reality, there was no noticeable increase in radiation levels due to Russian troop movements. The mysterious spikes recorded by the EcoCenter equipment attracted the attention of both radiation safety professionals and cybersecurity experts. The airborne dust hypothesis has been dismissed as implausible by numerous sources cited in an article on Wired.com. The paper published in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity in September 2023 is especially detailed and is linked in the video description. Its authors speculate that the EcoCenter equipment may have been reporting false values due to electromagnetic radiation or wireless interference. Given the powerful electronic warfare systems employed by the invading Russian forces, this certainly seems plausible. On the other hand, cybersecurity researcher Ruben Santamarta has concluded that this is unlikely. He suggests that the EcoCenter site was simply the target of data manipulation, possible via cyber attack. In the fog of war, it is difficult to tell exactly what the goal of this data tampering could have been. But if it was an attack, it was wildly successful at getting under our skin. The radioactive dust cloud was only an appetizer. Now we are ready to address the real media frenzy. I suspect I am about to disappoint many viewers, who enjoyed the tragicomic story of ignorant Russian soldiers digging trenches in the Red Forest, only to end up with radiation sickness. Well-regarded media outlets were especially credulous in publishing these rumours, which all seem to have stemmed from a single social media post. Once it was established that the invaders had indeed been foolish enough to dig trenches in the 10-kilometre zone, a Chernobyl tour operator published this photo on Facebook. He claimed that a Belarusian Telegram channel had reported the arrival of 7 busloads of soldiers to a radiation hospital in Gomel. It was off to the races as government spokesmen began amplifying the story. No further evidence was ever presented, but the headlines would soon circle the globe. The first footage of the Red Forest trenches was released soon after the Russians fled from northern Ukraine. The fortifications consisted of several ditches for armoured vehicles, a sandbag firing position, and a small handful of slit trenches. Rough radiation measurements were taken by both local journalists and the IAEA. Dose rates seem to have been just a few microsieverts per hour of gamma exposure, plus a several thousand counts per minute of beta activity. The threshold for acute radiation sickness is 1 million microsieverts, or 1 sievert, so it is simply not possible that any soldier experienced these symptoms. The occupiers would have needed to spend over 400 days in the trenches just to exceed the 50 millisievert annual dose limit of a nuclear worker. In other words, the Russians chose a relatively safe location on the very edge of the Red Forest. Digging inside the exclusion zone did violate all manner of safety rules, not to mention common sense itself. But after all, this is a military that commits war crimes on an industrial scale. What do they care? But wait, you might say. Highly radioactive waste is buried in the Red Forest. Wouldn't the Russians have exposed themselves to far more dangerous material by digging down into the soil? The answer is that the invaders chose a spot quite far from the actual disposal area where contaminated tree trunks were buried. Furthermore, most of the fallout in the exclusion zone is found in the top 10 centimetres of sandy soil. So, ironically, lying at the bottom of a deep trench could actually reduce your exposure to gamma radiation. Okay, so gamma radiation wasn't a problem, but what about the inhalation and ingestion of alpha and beta emitting isotopes? After all, strontium-90 is 4 times worse than cesium when inhaled, while plutonium and americium can be up to 7,000 times more dangerous. It definitely sounds plausible that the soldiers received high radiation doses from inhaling dust. But what does radiation science have to say? As it turns out, a 2017 paper set out to answer this precise question. The authors calculated what would happen to people who settled unawares in the Red Forest. These hypothetical new residents were assumed to spend an entire year there. Not just living, but digging and gardening as well. In other words, they would have been exposed to all the same inhalation and ingestion hazards as a soldier living in the trenches. The estimated dose for spending 1 year in the area where the trenches were dug: 2 to 5 millisieverts. Most airline pilots and flight attendants receive more than that. In fact, the paper's authors calculated that only a few locations in the Red Forest could result in a dose of 1000 millisieverts or more. This is above the threshold for acute radiation sickness, but no such symptoms would arise if the dose was spread out over 12 months. In other words, the Russian soldiers could have acted even more stupidly and still gotten away with it. Other calculations performed during the Red Forest media frenzy tended to reach the same conclusion. Nuclear professionals usually hate it when journalists sensationalize their field. So, some helpful radiation workers on Reddit decided to crunch the numbers using their proprietary software. Later on, the IAEA estimated a dose of 6.5 millisieverts for anyone spending a full year in the trenches. Let's take things a step farther and imagine that the Russians were doing everything in their power to get radiation poisoning. Just how much dirt would they need to eat in order to receive those 1000 millisieverts? According to these estimates, a mad soldier would need to chow down on 117 kilograms of soil. Or, alternatively, he could try to snort 3.5 kilograms of dust. And I should point out that this is assuming the soil is from the most contaminated part of the Red Forest, not the relatively safe area where the trenches were dug. At this point, you might be wondering whether the Red Forest's reputation for radioactive peril is exaggerated. Well, yes and no. Lurking amongst the lightly contaminated dust are so-called hot particles. These are flecks of nuclear fuel with a diameter of just a few microns. They can contain several thousand becquerels of plutonium. A very unlucky individual who inhaled just a few of these could easily receive a radiation dose of 1000 millisieverts or more. However, because this would be gradual and localized alpha exposure, it is still basically impossible for typical radiation sickness symptoms to occur. The actual result would be an increased probability of developing a lethal cancer, a 5 to 10% chance overall. So these hot particles cannot explain the rumours from March 2022. They simply show why the inner parts of the exclusion zone may still be considered dangerous even 200,000 years from now. Could there be any kernel of truth to the radiation sickness rumours? Perhaps. Footage from the fortified area shows scorch marks on the grass, as if a wildfire had swept through the camp. Did the occupiers suffer ordinary burns instead of radiation burns? We can also speculate that they panicked after experiencing symptoms of radiation poisoning, which had some other cause. Nausea and diarrhea? Bad rations? Headaches and dry mouth? Too much luted alcohol? Exhaustion, confusion, and nerves? That is just part of being in a war zone. What we do know is that the hospital in Gomel, Belarus does not actually treat radiation sickness. It contains a full-body counting machine designed to monitor the amount of cesium-137 that local residents ingest with their food. Ukrainian authorities also reported that Russian soldiers looted radioactive sources from the laboratories in Chernobyl. In all, they made off with 1 million becquerels of material. This may sound like a lot, but in fact, anyone with $60 and an eBay account can easily buy radium antiques boasting 6 or 7 million becquerels of total activity. After all the commotion over radioactive Russians, a Ukrainian nuclear agency had to perform a large-scale sweep of the region to search for contamination. Their search only turned up a single radioactive object. It was a Soviet antique watch containing radium paint. If the last few minutes of the video still don't have you convinced, Then why not get the truth right from the horse's mouth? Remember the tour operator who started this whole story in the first place? He eventually told the Washington Post that it was all a huge exaggeration, meant to cause panic in the Russian ranks. The boring truth is that if Chernobyl's occupiers ended up in the hospital, it is because they went to Donbass and came down with acute lead poisoning. All in all, these latter-day Red Forest myths are a good reminder that radiation safety is a complicated subject. Intuition will only get you so far without doing the math. You can almost never trust news articles about radiation, simply because most journalists don't understand the topic themselves. And just because you support Ukraine's resistance to imperial aggression doesn't mean you need to believe every silly rumour that comes along. Understanding subatomic particles is ultimately much easier than dealing with the fog of war.